Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Soul Rising podcast. Thank you so much for joining me for yet another show. Today, I have my lovely guest, Rachel Garcia. She is the host of the Grieve Informed podcast. She is a single working mom of 4 beautiful teenagers living in Birmingham. 4. Yeah, 4. That's a lot. Not really for here, though. In Castle Rock, Colorado. I was actually at a book club yesterday, and one of the women had 8 kids, has 8 kids.
She wins. Gladly.
Win.
She can have, yeah.
One of the another one had 6, and they were all ex-Mormons. So the Mormon religion, they have a lot of kids. But anyway, yeah, 4 is plenty.
Yes.
Living in Birmingham, Alabama.
Yeah.
Worked as a doula and a childbirth educator for 10 years, dabbling in life coaching. She found her niche this season of life through having long-form conversations about the ways we are each affected by grief and the ways in which we can better show up for ourselves and for others in that sacred practice. Rachel went through some serious loss at a very young age, the death of both of her parents, but it was divorce that really taught her another level of grief, which she wasn't quite prepared for. So let's hear about your story, Rachel. If you want to tell us a little bit more about how grief shows up in your life and how that divorce kind of probably kicked your butt a little bit, huh?
It sure did. Hi. Thank you for having me. Okay. Well, I came to Birmingham from New Mexico when I was 5, and I always describe my upbringing as, if you remember Jerry Springer, that show, yeah, it was like a good casting call for the show was my upbringing. So without dabbling into all of the ways that was wild, my mother passed away when I was just about to be 11. It was 11 days before my 11th birthday. She had lupus and complications from lupus, but now we can live a long life with that, thankfully. But at the time, it attacked her heart, and her heart stopped at 36. And she had 3 children. She had just recently married my stepdad, who was the only dad that I remember or knew. And he passed away in a car accident when I had just turned 20. And so in a beautiful turn of events later in life, when I was in college, I went to live with a family that offered for me to stay in their basement apartment on the cheap. And they had 4 children, but I lived with them. And at the end of like a 6-month tested out period, this was for free. They were offering me to live in their home. They said, why don't you just stay for as long as you want? Maybe until you get married. Ha, ha, ha. And I did. And so I was 21 when I moved in with them, and then 25 when I got married, and they walked me down the aisle. It was so beautifully redemptive. And then I got 4 extra siblings. So sometimes when I refer to mom and dad, I do talk about my bio parents, but then I also talk about which that's part of the story. On the eve of my 30th birthday with 2 small children, they offered to legally adopt me. And so I was legally adopted by them when I was 30 and became a part of their family officially. So I have adopted parents, and I also have my bio parents. So that's a little bit of my background. I was married for 15 years, was divorced 6 years ago, and have, as we said, 4 teenagers. So yeah, it's a fun time. To answer that grief question, I think I knew a lot about bereavement. I would say not necessarily when my parents died. I was definitely ill-informed about how to get through grief after my mom died. And then really, I would say, started to get some true guidance after my dad died. And because it was all hands on deck, I had nothing, like no parents, and it was in emerging adulthood, and it was a very scary time. And so I think I really tried to cling to okay, how can I do this? How can I actually honor the things that are happening inward in my inner world that a lot of people didn't know about in my external world? And I think that just kind of catapulted even more once I hit divorce, and because nobody gets married planning on divorce. And my kids always say, they joke and they're like, you always said you wanted 4 kids. And I said, yes, but I didn't anticipate that I would be raising them full time on my own. in primary custody. But yeah, it's been a journey to actually learn how to honor the grief of something that a lot of people walk through. But I was really blown away by the different ways in which I needed to learn to grieve after divorce.
What are the ways in which you grieved that divorce? What did that look like for you?
Well, I think what I love, John Onwuchekwa says that grief is like a language. It's not necessarily a journey where there's an end in sight, but
Hmm.
in that learning a language, there's dialects, there's different ways of speaking that language. And I think that had a lot of times confused the grief that came with bereavement as the same way that it would be approached in divorce. And he also talks about that was so freeing for me about there's two types of grief. Like there is the very visceral, you see someone dies, there's a body in the ground, there's tears and people come around you and support, and there's casseroles till your heart's delight and all of the people supporting you. But then there's also ambiguous grief,
Yeah.
which are things that we lose that nobody sees. They can't attach, oh, your tears or your sadness makes sense because they can see the natural effects of that outside of your world. And so divorce or loss of relationship, loss of dreams, loss of support, not just divorce, but people have experienced that through so many ways where people don't know why you're sad or why you might be struggling
Hmm.
because it's a very private thing. And I
Hmm.
think, yeah, our culture doesn't do a great job talking about grief in general, much less the ambiguous, the what we don't see. Yeah.
Yeah, and it feels like there's a lot of judgment around ambiguous grief, right? Like there's kind of like, well, that's not, a big deal. Why should you be grieving that? They're still alive. So again, it would be
Yeah.
the loss of that wish, say, of a relationship with a parent or with a child. And then judgment, like, oh, it's really not that way. Why do you think it's that way, right? When it's like a loss of a fantasy or a wish. Well, it's like, well, no,
Absolutely.
that's how I see it. That's how I'm experiencing it. And it feels like grief. So yeah, I think it's a harder one to put your finger on than when you actually see a body in a coffin and you get that closure.
Yeah, it is. And then you're also dealing with the grief of your children or the grief of your family members and these losses that don't get to be talked about very much, or you don't want to make them public. Even talking on a podcast, I have to be very careful about what I say because my
Sure.
kids listen. This is their dad that I was in relationship with, but speaking generally about loss after divorce, absolutely, or grief after divorce is a huge topic. But I think it's really curious to me the underlying why somebody would say, "Why are you grieving? Why are you sad?"
Mhm.
There's to me that so much of our culture is used to putting qualifiers on whatever we feel or whatever somebody else is feeling. There's this sense of you have to prove to me why you're allowed to grieve. And I feel like that's the part of our culture that just has to shift. But also, I think points to that person's upbringing. If you weren't
Mm,
used to, as a child, being attuned to and your needs being met, then you will likely judge the same thing than when somebody else is doing that for themselves. And to
def
me, it just speaks to a deeper core wound that might be there.
definitely.
Yeah.
So what does grief informed mean? The name of your podcast is the Grief Informed Podcast. So what is that and how did you come to that? How did that become your passion?
Well, I don't know if you remember, that was like 5 or 6 years ago. It felt like the buzzword was trauma informed. Everything was trauma informed, and I loved it because it was. I mean, I love learning about trauma, and how it's affected my life, and how do I love personal growth and development for sure. When I had the idea, only because of my son, to do a podcast and I could talk about anything I wanted, I thought I would love to talk about grief. And honestly, the term grief informed just thought was along the same vein of trauma informed. Like we can be informed about how our grief affects us and how we are affected by our experiences and how that might lend to the need to grieve or to learn to grieve. And so I just wanted to create a space where people are learning about grief and hearing other people's stories in that process. Yeah, so I came through that idea because my son started his own podcast his senior year in high school, and I was his guest, second guest, and we had such a blast. And after that was done, I had three people that loved me that said, "You've got to do that. You've got to do a podcast." And I was like, "You've got to shut your face. That's not no, that's a terrible idea." And because what do I know? I knew nothing about any of this tech, but um, I I had such a blast. And one of the things that I love to do is talk to people and have conversations. So it was a natural flow. And the grief informed came from the idea of really wanting to help people be informed about how they might be affected by different topics and hearing different people tell their stories to help support them in learning about grief.
Well, you are a perfect host. I was on your show and I really enjoyed it. And you
Thank
make
you.
people feel so comfortable. You have such a great personality. Like, I just
Oh,
love
thanks.
you. You know, I really
Yeah,
enjoyed our time together then and now. And like, you're just bubbly and happy, but like, you also touch on some serious stuff. And that
yeah.
is a gift, right? To be able to
Thank you.
bring levity just through your actions, your mannerisms, the words you choose, just your body language, the whole thing. So yeah, you
Thank
definitely are
you.
cut out for that. So part of this grief informed journey, and you touched on the word, you said permission before.
Ah, yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that, like giving people permission to grieve. Like, yeah, we touched on it just before about how there's some judgment and stuff like that. But I really like that topic because I think there are people who go like lifetimes without grieving these things because they feel like they're not allowed to, that they're going to look weak or, even give it, not even from other people permission, but permission from themselves, maybe, right? To go into that pain and maybe it's the fear holding them back? What do you think about that?
Well, I think honestly, a lot of people can't even attune maybe to the fact that they're even affected by the experiences they've had. I learned through context clues at, 14, 15, 16 years old after having lost my mom and being the girl that had the, dead mom, real fun at
Mm,
parties. Because what
mm,
I would observe is I would see the interactions that these girls had with their moms and just be so longing for like, gosh, I wish I could fight with my mom, but
yeah,
thinking, oh, I probably would never fight. I've just that idolization is a very real coping strategy,
yeah.
but the idea that I could actually, be around people and share my grief was not I mean, my friends were great, but I could tell when it was a buzzkill. So the idea of just being able to talk about something or to know to look for people that I could go to a deeper level and reveal deeper things that I was struggling with or feeling, that was something I was missing. And I didn't realize until later in life that I was actually deeply affected by these losses that I'd kind of put away as like, yep, lost my parents, but I'm in survival. I've got to move on. And it
Mm,
wasn't until my divorce and I started like diving into just some of my own personal patternings of like, what did I contribute to
sure.
and
Yeah.
the end of a relationship. And so when I started digging into that, I thought, oh, wow, this is really touching on a lot of things that I've kind of tucked away in a basement. And I didn't realize they were still affecting me, even though they were down in the basement. And
Mhm,
what it brought me to was learning how to actually face what was in the basement and build my capacity to actually grieve the things that were down there so that they could heal. So that when they come to the surface, they get love instead of being rejected and like, I'm not allowed to feel that. But the
mhm,
first step is just recognizing, am I affected by something? Could it be something 20 years ago? Could I
mhm,
still be affected? And a lot of people don't realize that one, they have permission to feel affected, even in the face of other people telling them that they shouldn't, or that time, you should be over it by now.
mm,
All of those things that we're used to hearing that really they're not a comfort and they're not true. You're always affected by the loss of your person or the loss of your parents or by navigating post divorce. This is something that will always affect you. It might affect you differently than it did then. One of the
mhm,
best things that I was told after my dad died was from a mentor at the time. And he said, Rachel, it was day 2. I mean, it was right after it. And he said, how you feel today, you're going to feel differently in 10 days. And in 10 days, you're going to feel differently than than right
Mhm.
now. He didn't
Mhm.
say better. He didn't say worse. He just said different, which left the door open for me to understand the cycle of how things feel, that nothing is permanent, that you're going to feel differently 10 years from now, but it doesn't mean it goes away. You're just going to feel differently about it, but it will still affect you. So,
Yes.
yeah, that's one of the things I feel like people just don't realize they have permission to be affected.
Yeah, and permission to keep feeling in those different stages, whatever they're going to
Yes.
feel that is different than where they are right now or where they were 5 years ago. And I like that you point that out, that it's not, oh, you're going to feel better, right? Like all the platitudes or whatever that people tell us.
Yeah.
It's is purely a different. And yeah, I think I probably do feel better now than 6 years ago when my brother died, which is my big one. I have a lot of other loss, but that was the big one. Um, but there were other things along the way that popped up, right? Like you're saying, these things in the basement that like we don't
Yeah.
look at. That's what grief does. Grief is
Yes.
such like its own animal. You cannot control what's going to come up. Like a friend just
Mm.
texted me before and said, "You got any words of wisdom for me? My father just passed away 2 weeks ago."
Mhm.
And I basically said, just share about it, talk about it, and because whatever things pop up, things from your childhood are probably going to come up, right? That's what happens when we
Yeah.
allow ourselves to feel it. And I think that's why a lot of people choose not to, and they keep it in the basement until they're on their deathbed and
Yeah.
and pass with those things still kind of haunting them. Um, because it's really, really painful stuff to go through, especially those childhood wounds, and
Yeah.
growing up is hard to begin with. And then you lose your mom. That's like so difficult. So I commend you like a million times over for doing that work, but
Thank you.
it was the divorce, right? That prompted
Yeah.
all the
Yeah,
rest.
because well, when I'm looking at my relationship patterns, I did this program through Lacey Phillips with To Be Magnetic. Love her work. And she has you go into deep diving into it's a lot of neuroplasticity, rewiring, and you go back into early childhood and you write about the relationship your parents had, you write about what you witnessed, and you write about what you experienced with money, and like you're tackling all these big theme money, relationship, and career. And so I was doing all these deep dives into early childhood development, like 0 to 7. And I just was like, whoa. That's when the
Yeah.
Jerry Springer came online because part of my part of my coping strategy through all young adulthood was to idolize my parents. I needed some kind of positive like regard for
Yeah.
that's what you want, and you want to believe that had they been here you would have, it would have looked like this. And then when I got in post divorce and I'm going in and diving into these things that I've never touched, like I knew the stories but I
Mhm.
never knew them, like sat with
Yeah.
them and actually like
Yeah.
what actually happened. And when I did, it hit because I realized that I didn't have the things that I needed to necessarily be prepared in ways that I needed to, and that was a grief. Like, okay,
Mhm.
yes, from here forward, I can move forward. I can learn those skills. I can go to the places where those things will get healed. But there was this like masking this reality that felt very painful to be with, and I had to really work to really face it and go, this is hard to see, but this explains why these same things are showing up at, 46. To
Mhm.
be able to look at that. And so I think being able to have permission to be affected is the first real thing, but two, being able to attune to what you need and attune to what's needed in a moment when you are affected. Like, okay, it's not enough to just go, yeah, this really did affect
Mhm.
me. And this is now it's what do I need in light of this? Like, what
Mhm.
can I do to support myself to give permission to feel through it? And what does it look like to attune to me in this space of experience, showing what I experienced as a young child or during my marriage or post divorce, all of it is being able to focus on also what do you need to be able to process that grief.
So what were those things for you? What were those needs that needed to be met? Can you think of a couple like off the top of your head?
Yeah.
Just a yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So my dad was killed in a car accident. I didn't think that I was affected by that with my own children until my firstborn wanted to drive somewhere by himself. And it was his first time he'd been driving by himself for a while, but it was like a school event and he wanted to take his younger brother and they were going to go to this basketball game. They'd made the championship and yada, yada, yada. And I just was a no, like, and he's like, because he is such a gracious kid, he sat me down and was like, "Okay, can you explain to me what's happening for you?" And I was like, all I could explain was it just felt like fear, like this major anxiety came up, and I didn't recognize it until he said, "Mom, you know I'm a good driver, and I would communicate with you every step of the like I'll tell you when I get there. I'll tell you. Do you think this has something to do with your dad?" I was like,
Wow.
I think it does, but I
Mhm.
need a minute. Like I need a minute because what I realized as soon as he brought that up, yeah, it was like a projection screen for me. This prior loss that I didn't think had any effect. My dad died in 1998. Like I just didn't think it had an effect in my body until that moment where my child was trying to get out on his own and this where I always thought I would be the mom that would be like, yes, take your keys and go for it. Each one of my children, when they have gone to take that first drive, I've had to be gracious with myself because I want to judge. I want to say, how dare you, Rachel? You're taking away from their limelight. But they've been so gracious with me and
Mm.
modeled that graciousness with me that and for myself to be able to say, no, that really does still affect me. I don't have to make choices from that space, but
Mm.
I want to honor that I am affected and that it's
Yeah.
okay that this produces anxiety for me. So now what do I need? What do I do to attune to the need? I need to reassure myself and be with myself and come back into what I know to be true and realize my child is safe. I mean, as far as we know, but nothing's certain, and let him go. But that process for me doesn't look like my best friend who's like throwing the keys and get out of the house. That I have permission to be affected, but I also want to make decisions that, okay, well, what would I need to do what I'm wanting to do from this position? That's one thing that I realized that, oh, it's okay to be affected and to also be nervous the entire time until he gets back home and then it eases up.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Like we could know logically, they say the longest journey is from the head to the heart. We could know, but those neural pathways are still so carved that we could try to tell ourselves logically, it's okay. He's going to be okay. The chances are very, very slim that something's going to
Yeah.
happen, right? Logically, we can look at statistics. We can like talk ourselves off the ledge, but it's still showing up in our body. And before I do
Yeah.
want to talk about like the body, mind, body connection when it comes to
Yeah.
grief. But I want to point out like that being gracious with yourself, that
Mm.
was the need, that was
Yes.
what you needed. And I think that is so important. We are shifting out of a time of this like massive, like degrading ourselves into, good behavior or acting well or shaming ourselves into
Yes.
certain behaviors when certain behaviors come up. We're just so used to that technique as a way to force ourselves to be different. And it
Yeah.
doesn't work. It
Yeah.
does not work, right? I
Yeah.
say you cannot beat shame at its own game. It's going to make you feel even worse. Shaming is
Right.
never a technique that works. So the opposite of shame would be that graciousness, would be that
Yeah.
self-compassion, would be that self-love and say, it's okay. This is
Yeah.
a very reasonable and rational response to what happened to me, right? That I
Yep.
would really be afraid when these things come up. That's trauma. That's trauma.
Yeah.
That's what trauma does, right? That's PTSD. That's when you're in similar situations or anything even resembling it, that fear comes up and then that anxiety hits. And that's such a great indicator. So let's talk a little bit about the mind body connection of grief. Like, how do you know? Is there anything else aside from anxiety that kind of informs you? Talking about the grief
Oh,
inform. that kind of
Yeah.
informs that you're in it.
Yeah. I want to touch back on
Yeah.
something you said because
Yep.
one thing I'm learning is going to, I feel like it's at a cult level. When I start getting new information, something and it takes off in my brain, I just like want to absorb all of it. But there is a teacher, a psychologist, Dewey Freeman, and I got to interview
Right.
him on the podcast. But he
Okay.
has taught over 50 years. He came up with a development model for attachment through birth to 7, and came up with the 5 phases that people are growing through. But he says that what we needed in childhood was contact, and contact over time creates connection. Connection over time creates relationship, and relationship over time creates intimacy. So if when we were younger in contact, we got contact, but it wasn't consistent or it wasn't with intention to connect,
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
we would we'd break contact, we'd not get our needs met, and then we might try through addiction or through um, anger to get those needs met. And so,
Or codependent relationships, I would think too,
sure,
just
right.
unhealthy relationships, a
You're
desperate
going
attempt.
to, yes, yes. And so, one of the ways that he describes that contact and judgment cannot exist at the same time.
Mm.
So contact is, and I don't have it with me, his definition of contact, but it's basically a connection to your higher self, to your heart, to the essence of who you are, or with another person. It's your authentic self in that moment. That
Okay.
cannot exist at the same time that shame or judgment exists.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so the moments I know I break contact with myself are when I know that I'm judging or I'm in shame over anything, over feeling or inner critic. Or so to answer your question, somatically, when I know for me personally that I'm in it and I have broken contact, that's when I'm doom scrolling. That's when I will, if I'm affected by something, but I'm not willing to recognize that I'm affected yet, I will go into freeze. Usually I go into a state of freeze. And so it will take me a moment, but the only thing that will get me out of that state is that compassion, is the ability to say, Rachel, it's okay. I see that you are going through it right now.
Hmm.
How do we come back into the body? How do we come back online and in contact with myself? Where am I judging myself? Where am I shaming myself? And as I do that, that freeze thaws and I'm able to come back online into my body and be
Hmm.
able to process the grief or face the difficult circumstances that I'm experiencing. I'm able to do that better when I'm able to hold myself in compassion and hold myself with that graciousness.
I think it feels safer. I think you're in like a safe place, with
Yeah.
yourself. Like,
Yeah.
and even holding space for yourself for a moment until you can really move into that. I feel like that's what happens for me too. The distraction, I'll look for 97 other things to do to keep me really busy. I'll feel like I need to clean the toilets for some like odd reason, like just like whatever I need to do to like not face what I know is true. What I
Yeah.
know is really my truth. And sometimes that takes longer than, a half an hour. Sometimes that
Yeah.
takes days, weeks,
Right.
months some of these major truths to surface for me to be willing to look at them. Like,
Yeah.
so what I wanted to ask you too before the question popped up, why do you think you were willing to do this really difficult work versus somebody who might live with this pain in the basement forever?
Um, I think a lot of my obsession with self development in my 20s had to do, a lot of it was codependently. I think, in a sense of, if I can fix myself,
Yeah.
then I will be lovable. Then I'll be good enough. If I can just
Yes.
fix everything that's wrong with me.
Yeah.
Um, and I think now I have a softer approach to my humanness, and just knowing that perfection is not the goal. It's more of, for me, I really do want to shift the legacies for my kids. I want them to see that their their lineage, while Jerry Springer, which they don't even know who that is, um, and I couldn't even think of one for their peers, but an equivalent of that. But it's just messy. And and
Mm.
I'm okay with messy. I just want to be able to help them learn how to honor what their experiences are and to be able to learn the strategies and the skill set to be able to shift the trajectory into one of healing and restoration and transformation to redeem what feels like was lost because of the pain of my family history.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing how it lives in our cells? Like,
Yes.
even if we're great parents now, our kids are still going to have their own work to do because
Oh, absolutely.
until, right, then they have children, then they have children, right? It's going to take generations for this stuff to be eradicated. But like, you're totally
Mm.
breaking things here. Like, you are totally trying to stop the cycle, just like I am. And we're doing it. We're doing it. But that doesn't mean that our kids are never going to experience some of what we're talking about because it is in our DNA. Like, is this
Yeah.
generation trauma, this stuff? So I think our generation, or maybe, yeah, probably our generation, I think are the first ones on like a mass scale that are doing this kind of work. It's just a whole different conversation. Like I talked about this recently on another show that the language wasn't there. It just wasn't a
Yeah.
thing to like be willing to do work like this for our parents and their parents to experience a major grief, a major traumatic loss, and then say, okay, this is popping up now. I'm going to bravely look at this. Like it just
Right.
wasn't like a thing. It just didn't exist, you know? But
And we didn't have social media. I mean, the people that I followed right after my divorce, I cannot credit enough with just putting sound bites in my
yes,
brain
yes,
constantly that were accounts that, I mean, you have to want to follow them.
yes,
But you want to follow the people that are drawing to your awareness things that you might be tuned out with, especially in relation to your own patterns and things that you might not be aware of that are
mhm,
affecting you. And so, yeah, the social media aspect of being able to see, wow, we have so much available to us, just following specifically people who are divorced or just following people who've lost parents, or you've got somebody who can speak to your experience in a very specific way that we didn't have when we were
yeah,
growing up.
yeah. And our
I had
parents have,
yeah, no, I had Sally Field and Steel Magnolias, and that was
yes,
the extent. Her teaching me how to grieve at the funeral scene
yep,
was
yep,
the most impactful thing I could ever think of. It held me through a lot, but I didn't get to do that with
yeah,
anybody. But I
yeah,
thought, wow, that's possible. So you can grieve like and
yeah.
yeah, I did. That was what I had was
That just gave me
Sally.
chills when you talked about that because I remember that scene of her. Oh, and she was so angry, you know, and like
Yes,
I'll never forget that scene either. So we didn't have our parents, their parents didn't have these examples on what grieving looks like and what's possible. And like you're saying, these little sound bites, these tidbits of information that make us pause and say, oh, is that me? Is that how I'm feeling? Oh,
right.
and this is what I do about it. We're being
Yeah,
guided. So I have a lot of, issues with social media and technology and
I
the
do
way the
too.
world works right now. Yeah, I think I'm getting old and I think it's just, part of the process. But
Yeah,
definitely is very helpful for that. We are
yeah,
jump timelines like exponentially because we have access and exposure to
yes,
all people that are doing this great work that know so much more than I know, and then
yeah,
I hear it, I internalize it or I do it or whatever. I have my experience and then I pass it on to somebody else. And I
yeah,
think that's the beauty of the amount of women like us that are in this work and doing this work and other women who are not on podcasts, but are doing it in their own
right.
families, doing this stuff, quietly. Um,
Yeah,
it's in mass and the energy I think is really just building around that. And it's really a beautiful thing to
it
see
is.
because it's hopeful. It's hopeful. It gives me hope that
Yes.
things are changing and that my kids, their kids don't have to live in as much pain, that they'll
Yeah,
have the tools, right? I think about some of like
yeah.
we talk about at dinner and I'm like, that would
Yes.
never have like
Exact
been at all, like even in the realm of possibility because it just wasn't a thing. It wasn't a
Yeah,
thing. So I always say it's a very painful time to live, but it's a very exciting time to live.
yeah,
Um, and
absolutely.
we're doing it. We're doing the work. So
We are.
what are some of your tried and true go-tos? Like when the grief pops up, when you feel that anxiety or when you feel that rise or you just know like there's a fear there or something's going on and I have to deal with this. What are some of the things that you turn to? Do you have any couple of things that you just automatically go to?
For me personally, I get overwhelmed a lot. And so when I get stressed, it brings up my pain points, my triggers, if you would. the
Mhm.
uh, if I'm anxious about purchasing, like we've got to purchase a car for my kid, another car because the last one didn't make it. And something like that brings up my scarcity of what it feels like to be scared that there's not enough money or will more come in, which is a common theme of my childhood when I was very young and even up through college. And so we were very poor. And so that, but knowing now I'm not. But my biggest is truly trying to, for me, I love hiking. I will go for a walk, getting in nature. I had one therapist that was constantly telling me, Rachel, just put your feet on the ground, just put your feet on the ground. So growing my ability to come back into my body
Mm,
will help me to eventually to feel what needs to be felt. So attuning to my body is really big. If I'm activated, then I need to calm my body before I can try to tackle something like emotion. Or maybe as soon as I am doing this active thing, then I'm able to release because my body feels more relaxed and capable. My doula work lends to this very much. The work that I did with mothers through the process of labor, like we know that it's going to be waves. It's going to be waves, but we can handle them because we have a plan, and it's usually to try to get as relaxed as possible during
right.
the actual wave. And so, what I do is nature, lots of nature, or I will move my body. I'm learning right now. Not as great at it, but I'm learning. Michaela Boehm has a book, but she talks about, and the name of the book is escaping me, but nonlinear movement, how we're trained. And I was trained in ballet in childhood, and so for me to not move with purpose and intention and look a certain way is very difficult. But I'm learning
Mm,
how to just move my body, dance. Some might call it dance, but um, just being able to move. It could be shaking limbs. It can be anything that gets to move whatever is happening for me, especially if I feel stuck, if I feel a lot of anxiety. But support too, reaching out to friends. And I'm a huge believer in prayer. And I will ask people to pray while I do these things and pray for me while today because I'm meeting some heavier battles today. But I think the biggest thing for me is being able to tune into the body and be able to come back into the body. If I notice myself checking out, if I notice myself wanting to exit quickly, that's the invitation to come back
mm.
into contact with myself. Um, and like I said, that's something that I'm currently learning as well.
Yeah, and I think the way that we can consistently come back into our bodies is by feeling safe in our bodies. And we
Yes.
have to do certain work first in order to feel safe that we're not going to judge ourselves, right? That we're
Right.
not gonna feel guilt or shame, right? So if we are still carrying those things, I think that's when people are reluctant to come into their bodies. Like it's scary. It feels scary to come into a place
Absolutely.
that feels unsafe to me. But that's where the massive healing is, right? You're touching on all this great stuff that it is within ourselves and creating that safe place by doing this healing that comes
Yes.
up because of it's all grief to me. It's all loss. I feel that is our major issue, like personally, as a society, is this inability to feel safe to grieve the big things and the smaller things, which aren't small to some people. But for me, it's breath work. I do a lot of breath work. I've been doing a lot of breath work lately, and that seems to just reset that nervous system and just get
Mm.
me in this calm space. And then that's when I can tackle the bigger things, the bigger emotional issues, right? Usually I'll do the
Yeah.
breath work down to meditate and then I'll do some writing. And I'm in a much calmer, safer place. When I'm tense, when I'm anxious,
Yeah.
my body's not gonna my spirit, whatever, it's just not gonna let me go into those places where I feel threatened because I'm
Yeah.
trying to protect
Yeah.
myself. So
One
there's
of
just
one
gonna
of
be
my
a hard stop.
It's a no. One of my favorite tells is when people say, "I feel like I wanna cry." And I'm like,
Mm,
"Okay. What could you do that would be putting yourself in an environment where it would be safe to do that?
Yes.
To cry.
Mm.
Because that's what's needed. You feel like you want to cry. I want to cry. You're acknowledging I'm affected. What I
Yes.
need is that I feel like I want to, but the feeling is here. It's not actually feeling, it's just this
Yes.
mental place. And so to
Yes.
drop back into what would it look like to create the environment where you get to cry? I feel like I want to yell and scream and punch a wall. Okay, great. What would it look like to create an environment where you can yell and scream and punch something? That's allowed. Like it's okay to do that. You are affected. Now, what do you need? What do you need to create in order to attune to that need? I think is a big question.
That's huge. Permission to grieve. I think that's probably going to be the name of the show because that's just, it's
Yeah.
so simple. It's so simple, but it's something that we just don't do. We're so hard on ourselves. We get a lot of judgment, like we talked about before, from outside, but the worst is the ones that we do it to ourselves.
Oh,
And
I can beat myself up better than anybody.
oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Because
I think too, like, this leads to the other part of it. Yes, you are affected. You're able to attune, but there is a healing that comes with vulnerability and being able to share that with those that feel safe, whether it's one person or whether it's a community that you feel safe in, to be able to give yourself the gift of connection in the space where you're trying to attune to grief. So like I said, you might not be able to think of one safe person, but you contact me. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to I know other people who are leading these spaces that would say, absolutely reach out if you don't have someone to talk to, because it can be very isolating and lonely, but it doesn't have to be. So
yeah.
if I didn't have the support and the willingness to be vulnerable in sharing what I'm going through with others or the people I'm in partnership with or my kids or any of that, then I won't actually see the support that I'm longing for, even if from myself.
Yes.
There's a next step that is being able to share that vulnerably with others as well.
Yes, you have to want to, and then you have to make the decision that you're going to seek that out. And then those people just appear. It's like,
Yeah.
say you want to, you're looking at buying a blue Honda, right? And you think about, oh, I think I might want a blue Honda. Then everywhere you go on the road, you see a blue Honda, right?
Yeah.
It's whatever is in our field of perception. So if we're thinking, no, I'm going to keep this to myself. No, I don't have permission for this. Or maybe I want to be a martyr, or I don't, I don't feel like I deserve to be happy, whatever it is, right? Staying in that pain, you're not going to see the avenues to move forward. So you have to first want it and then make that decision like, yeah, I'm going to actively seek this out, right? When a student
Yeah.
is ready to peers, that whole thing, that's
Yeah.
what it means. Like when I'm ready to actually move out of this pain, the right people are going to show up. The algorithm's going to work its magic. It's somehow weaseled into my brain and knew that I was ready, right? And it's going to show me the things that I need to see and need to learn and need to read. The books are going to come my way. The podcast, like the stuff is just going to arrive when I finally, truly, wholeheartedly, genuinely am ready and
Yeah.
willing and willing. It all comes back to that willing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're kind of coming up to the end here. So before I ask you how everybody can learn about you, listen to your show, where they can find you, um, is there any little what's the greatest thing you've learned from your guests or from your own journey that would help people move through this process more gracefully?
I think the biggest thing we've touched on the compassion. I remember Googling what the opposite of grief was. I didn't like the answer. It was joy. I Googled it like again, like let's just see, maybe they were slow. I don't know. Um, but I feel like the hardest part that for my journey of what I've learned and been able to witness and come to appreciate is to move from grief to joy. There's this middle space. And I believe that middle space comes in the form of hope. Like that's what genuinely turns the tide from, yes, there's grief, but then this willingness to see the cyclical nature or to be comforted by something that brings hopefulness leads to more joy. But what I've learned is I want to pay attention to that middle part a little bit more. And sometimes it's messy. So, my podcast, being able to interview people, yes, they're coming on because they're telling their story, but they're coming on to tell about that middle part, that before they got to the joy, before they got to that hopefulness, they're telling their story and what was difficult and what was messy and what doesn't have a bow tied on it. And to come on a podcast and go, yes, I've had all these losses, but now look at me. That's not the case. They're coming to share their very real story of struggle that continues, but that is very cyclical. You see loss and then you see restoration. You see hopelessness and then you see hope return. You see these things that come, it's, the both and, like you get to see,
Mhm.
you can experience multiple things at the same time. But in doing so, it just helps. It's encouraging to me. Like, I have never been more encouraged than having these wonderful guests on my podcast, because I'm like, okay, yes, we understand grief and we speak that language. That's kind of what unifies us. But it's like we're getting to see the different ways all of us have spoken that language. The part that's the messy part, the part that's the one that our culture doesn't really want to look at very much. And so I've deeply appreciated the vulnerability of others to share their story and not just give me the end of it. Give me
Mm,
I want to know what it was like when it was the darkest. I want to know, because I know that I've experienced that, and it feels like a resonance, and it feels like a collective joining in suffering together. Like, it feels very redemptive in that way to be able to say, I haven't experienced the same thing you have, but I speak this language, and you being able
mhm.
to share that with me makes an amazing, it's an amazing medicine for me, for my own journey.
That's beautiful. And that was so well said. Thank you so much, Rachel. You have been an amazing, uplifting,
Thank you.
hopeful, joyous, the and well, both and I love that, right? Sharing the pain, sharing the joy. You've covered all of that. You embody all of that very well. Thank you so much. So where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I don't have a website yet, and I'm on Instagram, Grief Informed Podcast. I would love to see you there. And anybody that would like to talk and needs someone to talk to, I'd happily be that person.
Wow, that's beautiful. I might take you up on that. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I
You're
I
awesome,
would love
Rachel.
to.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful having
Thank
you.
you. Thank
Okay.
you for having me.
Yeah, you got it.